What's up there, Workforce? Chris here with Work2Game, and let's talk about Wolcen. So I'm about 24, 25 hours in, and I've cleared the entire story once. It has kind of two difficulties: story difficulty, where you can clear it kind of on easy mode, and then normal difficulty as it was intended. I will say on normal that the gap between like the levels and the final bosses to each of the three acts is really large, so you're kind of forced to grind a little bit, as opposed to story mode where you can kind of just push on through. And I wanted to kind of give some of my initial thoughts. So first of all, isn't that game like buggy as crap? Like, isn't that game just terrible because it's launch? I will say the game had a bad launch. The game had a ton of bugs out of the gate, and basically it feels like they kind of released a full-priced product, full price being $40, not the typical $60 that we see here. But you know, a smaller studio had a Kickstarter, did their whole thing, and came out with a game at a lower price point, and then didn't really do like a proper large-scale beta or early access test. And so naturally, however much testing they were able to do, being a small studio, didn't match the quality assurance that we would expect out of a AAA studio. Not that we always get out of a AAA studio, but what we expect. And so the game felt like it had bugs. I mean, with the immense popularity it had out of the gate, you have to think that there were millions of hours played right out of the gate, and those millions of hours exposed lots and lots of issues. And some of those issues were exploits where people were actively seeking them, so the game testers or the reviewers may have never actually found them. And some of them are just issues caused by a variety of things, everything from varying internet connections to varying computer hardware to varying build strategies and weird things coming up in your game, things spawning a certain way, triggering certain problems, as well as just general things like frame drop or things not being targetable or anything like that. It had a lot of bugs. And so what they had to do in response is they had to start from the top down and tackle the most critical bugs, things like people not being able to connect, and then work their way down the list. Like, one of the things that I had is I went through, and in one of the cutscenes, it didn't do it the other time I saw this cutscene, but one of the cutscenes, my character stood at their arms like straight out, and I was on the phone. I was voice chatting with a friend who was in the cutscene with me, and I was like, "Why are we standing like that?" And he's like, "What are you talking about?" And I was like we're being frisked at the airport. And he said, "No, it's not doing that." And so we sent each other screenshots, and like I took a picture with my phone, and like it's bizarre. It's bizarre. So like, that's not a bug that I would expect them to fix if there's still critical issues. And that also means that they have not had the luxury of the time to be able to focus on things like balance. So there are certain builds that are coming out just substantially ahead of others. But that's the bad. That's all the reasons that people don't want to touch the game, or they're mad at the game. And that's really where a lot of the drama stems from, is people frustrated with the product not delivering on the expectations that they had when they purchased it. I will say, what does the game do well? Well, it's incredibly fun. It's more Diablo 2 than Diablo 3 was. So for people hoping that Diablo 3 would kind of just be a Diablo 2.5, and it wasn't the things that Diablo 4 is more promising to be, I would say that this is more of that. This is more that kind of thought. That's more what I wanted. So like, in some ways right out of the gate, it feels more at home than Diablo 3 did. Diablo 3 struggled from a bad launch as well. And out of that launch, it had a real money auction house. And when they pulled that auction house out, you have to think that every system in the game assumed it would be there. And so there were all these other ripple effects with the amount of loot we got and things like that really weren't able to be balanced by that auction house. So it just took them a long time to correct. And that's a much larger studio with a longer dev cycle, with more quality assurance, having similar levels of critical errors. And I don't think Wolcen struggles from any of those. So as you go through the story, it's going to feel like a lot like a carbon copy of systems from Path of Exiles, which I will self-admit I am not a huge player of. Like, I just never really got into it. I don't know if it was just timed at a time when I was focused on other games, or if it was just too grindy for me, because it does ask for a lot of your time. At the time, I don't know, but I'm not the Path of Exiles expert, not even anywhere close. So let's just assume I don't know anything about Path of Exiles, especially compared to people who've been playing it the whole time it's been out. So if you had to draw a triangle between what I do know of Path of Exiles as just an outsider, and then what I know of Diablo 2 from thousands of hours played, what I know of Diablo 3 from hundreds, if not probably still thousands of hours played, just not as many as Diablo 2. This feels like somewhere in the middle of that. And all through the leveling process, it's a direct carbon copy of things. The treasure goblins are from Diablo 3 are now beetles. I haven't seen them trigger a rift at all. I don't know that means there isn't one. I haven't spent a lot of time looking out there for like what the end game has to offer. I did Google it at one point, and like I didn't understand the acronyms being used, so I just kind of gave up and just played through the game. You play through kind of once you get through all 3 acts and all of the bosses. The bosses in difficulty for their level range, in my opinion, are the easiest boss was Act 2. The hardest boss was Act 1, with Act 3 being somewhere in between. And so once you get through all of that and you've finished it, you unlock this end game mode. And so you can now go in and you can do the 2 forms of end game. And this is where the carbon copy starts to differ just a little bit. Up until now, every system has been basically a direct rip with the exception of the way you build your character. And we'll talk about that in a second. So you have basically 2 forms of in-game content. You have expeditions, which are just rifts straight up. And then I think they're called mandates, which are basically open world or they're like quests. Mandates seem like if you die, you can kind of like if you're in a co-op, you can recover. I don't know if that's meant to be the case because the button to recover says undefined on it sometimes. So I don't know if that's just the text dropping or if you're not supposed to be able to not get kicked back to town. But for some reason in mandates, I can recover. And rifts, if you die, that's it. Rifts, you fill your bar, you take on the big boss, you're done. Mandates, you do what the task says. So it says fill the bar, and then you're done. Or it says kill the 3 things, you find them, you're done. Kill the one big bad guy, kill him, you're done. And so like mandates are a little more straightforward. And then from there, like when you go into the rifts, you can buy modifiers to make it harder. There's other in-game systems that pile on top of this. I have not unlocked them yet because this whole thing centers on a city building. So when you build this city, you're building the city with 3 resources. The first is gold. The second is these little orbs. I don't remember what they're called, but basically you get 100 of them every time you pick up a spell off the ground that you already know. The first time you pick up a spell, you learn it. Every time forward after that, when that spell drops, you get 100 of these little things, and you can funnel those in there. And the third resource is called productivity. So every time you complete a mandate or a expedition perfectly, right? Every time you actually survive to completion, you get completes what's called a turn. And every time a turn completes, your city gets productivity and it gets productivity based on a series of multipliers. There's a little score screen at the end of the activity that tells you how it determined how much productivity you got. And then that productivity completes towards active works. You can have a number of active productions going on at a time. And those are basically upgrades to your city. And those upgrades do everything like unlocking your 5th and final skill slot, to increasing the amount of gold find, to increasing, and there's even some that act as prerequisites for others. It's just an entire tech tree for your city, and some of it affects your character directly, and some of it is more indirect. And so that's kind of how your in-game system functions. That's very, very different than anything I've seen in a Diablo game. I've never made it far enough into Path of Exiles to know if that's something that is closer represented in that world. But it's neat. It's fun enough. It adds a huge mountain of content. I don't know if you deem that good content or bad, but it is a huge mountain of content to conquer after you clear the story. I cleared the story around level 40. I see some people clearing it around level 40 or all the way up to level 50. Just depends on how thorough you were as you went through, how much experience you kind of farmed up. And the first expeditions, I can't beat the final boss of because I'm too weak. And the first mandates, I can only beat them sometimes. And so I'm kind of farming up my productivity very slowly. But as I do that, I'm getting experience. My gear is building up. So I'm getting stronger. And that's when we start to talk about the character tree. The character tree is very different. So Path of Exiles, it's like infinitely complex. And Diablo, it's infinitely simple. Get the perfect set, pick the perfect skills. There's kind of only a handful of viable builds for each class, and not all classes feel equally viable each season. And that's from simple to most complex. This sits somewhere in between. Every character can be every class based on the weapons you have equipped. Certain skills require certain weapons to be equipped. So most of my sorcerer skills require that you have a staff or a catalyst equipped, a catalyst being a one-handed sorcerer weapon. Where that becomes interesting is that you can swap them to change your build at any time. It feels like even in combat, though I don't do that. I've definitely done it in between pulls. And from there, you can swap skills out at your leisure. You level your skills up kind of independent of you. They get experience, so you can use those orbs to kind of fast level them in case you have like a new build you want to try out and the skill's level 1. I'm coming up on, so my highest level skill is like 46 3/4. At 47 it unlocks its last rune, so I'll find out what happens then. I haven't looked it up. There's 16 runes to each skill, and those runes kind of help dictate. So they turn my fireball into lightning, or they turned it from me shooting 2 fireballs to shooting 3, or 1 to 2. They reduce cooldowns, they reduce costs, they increase crit, they do all sorts of things. And you get modifier slots to choose how many of those runes. So each rune costs anywhere between, it looks like 1 and 3 modifier slots, and then you unlock more and more modifier slots as you level that skill up. So by the time I was level 46, I think it's 7 modifier slots. So you have plenty of choice to kind of pick more than one thing. If you pick cheap things, you can get a lot of them. If you pick expensive things, you can only get a few of them, and you can build out your build that way. Now from there, you also have your character stats. You get 10 with every level. Your gear also has a lot of it on there, and there's basically 4 stats in the game. Ferocity is going to focus on the crit of things. Wisdom's going to focus on the ailment of things. Ailments are basically if you're hitting somebody with your axe and it causes them to bleed, that's an ailment. If you hit somebody with a dagger and it causes them to be poisoned, that's an ailment. If you hit somebody with a fireball and that lights them on fire, that's an ailment. So it's that afterwards effect, and ailments are broken into, all damage is kind of broken into one of 3 categories. You have material damage, which is your physical damage. That's really where your weapon damage is going to live. And then it's rend damage and toxic damage. You see those on weapons from time to time. And then you have your elemental damage. So think about sorcerers. That's your frost, your lightning, and your fire. And then you have your occult damage. And that's your sacred and your aether and your holy. And those are very specific to certain skills. Sometimes a skill actually has a rune that will allow you to change that ability's type. And the reason you would do that is because maybe there's other abilities in your build that use that type, so now you can go find gear that stacks that. Because gear might call out frost damage specifically, or it might call out all elemental damage, or all spell damage, or all damage. And so you can see how it builds up. And you get bigger percentages the more specific you go, typically, because that's how gear is balanced. The more effective it is across more things, the more they know, okay, this might be affecting multiple things in their build, and it tends to get toned back. So for the same eye level gear, I might find something that has 7% to all damage, or 10% to spell damage, or 13% to elemental damage, or 15% to frost damage. And so if I'm only trying to do frost damage, it would be best for me to get the most specific one as possible. And so it kind of allows for an interesting thing there. And as you put your character points in each of these 4 categories, you have ferocity is your crit, wisdom is your ailment, and the other 2 are toughness, which is just straight up survivability. You want as little as you can get by with, but you do need enough of it that you don't die. And the last one is agility, and agility actually affects how fast you shoot, so how fast you attack. And weapon speed and spell speed are very important. So all 4 end up being important to all builds. So even if you change your build later, you may not have to alter your stats that much, just depending on where it was at. Now, the other side of things is your passive skill tree. So you've got your gear so far, which is basically a Diablo style system where you've got commons into blues, into yellows, into your legendaries, and then there are unique items that live alongside legendaries, roughly, and then they each have a rarity, and then they have minimum item levels, starting with no item level required up to 5, and then it goes up by 4s there. So 9, 13, 17, 21, 25, 29, etc. And so when you're killing things, just know that they'll drop that next set below you. So when you're in the low 40s, you're going to find 41 gear until you get over that threshold and can start finding 45 gear. And that's the threshold. I don't know how high that goes. I don't know. Maybe it cuts off at 60. I don't know. I'm not all the way through this game. This is my initial impressions. So let's talk about the passive skill tree. So with gearing out of the way, with character stats out of the way, The passive skill tree is this giant circle, and it's got a circle in the middle with 2 rings on the outside. The outside rings can be rotated to adjust how they line up, so you could line them up so that you don't have to go all the way around the circle if the only thing you want from the outer ring is this one specific set. In each set of nodes, there's 3 types of individual nodes, individual moments. Each one takes 1 passive point to upgrade. You can get passive points from like upgrading your city, but mostly you're going to be getting your passive points from getting 1 per level as you level up your characters. Resetting your main stats costs gold, resetting these costs those spell points, and it costs an amount to reset based on the number you have, so it gets more expensive the higher you progress. So when you pick these up, each of the 3 node types fall into kind of one of, I would say, 3 categories. The first is going to be the smallest nodes. These are typically going to be things like plus to a primary stat, plus to percent damage, plus to whatever. And it's just going to be a straight up percentage of things or a straight up additional main stat or something like that. It's just going to make you better. Some are bigger than others, but effectively they're all the same concept. The next up is these, I would say, medium nodes, and they have like a little bit of an outline around them. And these, as just a general trend, tend to be just bigger. So if normally you're getting plus 10% crit on a small node, you might get plus 60% crit on these. Keep in mind that the way things are like added and stuff in this game, it's not like you're going to see 60% over what you're currently doing. It's going back to your base damage and adding that. So with additive and multiplicative multipliers, just be aware that in this game, if you see a plus 100%, it's not going to double you because you've already been doing a lot of doubling. So the last is your large ones. These large ones are the ones that are going to define your build. They're what you're working towards. I do not have a perfect build. I really didn't have much of a plan. I kind of picked a cool big one and I went for it. And then I picked another cool big one and I went for it. And I already know, and I knew I'm going to be new to this game. I'm going to make mistakes. And I planned on having to reset at least once. And I can tell you I should, because I have big ones that don't really do as much value for me as I thought they would. Basically, big ones are going to be the defining things. So like a big one might be like anytime you're at over 75% of your mana, you're going to crit. Very cool. Well, how does your mana work? We have purple mana, which is your willpower, and yellow mana, which is your rage, I think. And basically every time you use a spell, it's going to use up willpower. It's going to convert it into rage. Every time you use abilities as like your sword, it's going to use up rage and drive it into willpower. If you're focused on like a 2-handed weapon, like a 2-handed staff or a 2-handed sword or something like that, you're going to be forced entirely into one build. And so you're only going to use one. So like sorcerers are only using willpower. If you're a hybrid, you might have a sword and a catalyst equipped. So you might have something that pulls from both sides. But most of the time you're living either entirely off of the stuff you get from the yellow or the red, and your weapon is what's driving it the other way. So my staff forces rage over to willpower, and then my spells use it back up. And so that sounded really good, except for the fact that I don't spend a lot of time at 75% or more mana. And so you kind of want to pick those, and they ideally will have a more cohesive build, and they change your build permanently until you reset it, which is expensive. So especially early on. I assume later it'll become less expensive. It'll feel less expensive. But like changing your projectiles from 1 projectile to 2, that's a big deal. Changing the way things function, changing it to where life leech affects your shield instead of your life, that's a big deal. It's going to change the way things function inherently. There's one that like reduces my life, but then shifts the way things I might have summoned function. Well, that means if I ever switch to a build that doesn't have summons, I'm just taking that penalty. So you're going to want to pick these a little more carefully than the other ones, and the other ones are just things you hit along the way. And that really defines this game. That's the majority of this. That's this in a nutshell. So I went over a little bit of kind of what you do in Endgame. I went over a little bit about what makes this unique, and then a little bit about what makes it not unique and the bugs. Overall, it's a $40 game. It provides way more than 40 hours worth of joy, in my opinion. So it's an easy buy. Just know that it is not bug-free, that there are issues. And go in with that accordingly. If you cannot handle issues, if that just frustrates you to no end, it just gets under your skin more than anything else in video games, but you know you want to play this game, then wait. If you don't like ARPGs, never play this game. It's still very, very much an ARPG. But if you don't mind a few bugs and you understand that ARPGs take you thousands of hours, why not get started now? Because as they're fixing bugs, I've gotten patches, even in just the handful of days I've already been playing, I've seen patches roll out with bug fixes. They even had a few balance fixes, which I was impressed they got to. I think that the game is improving, and my character's not that great yet anyway. So I'm enjoying the process along the way. I'm hoping to kind of put out some guides here, because I know that for anybody that hasn't played a lot of ARPGs, or some of the content, I actually feel pulls from like MMOs and things like that. So I'm playing with one friend who plays a lot of ARPGs, and I'm playing with another friend that hasn't played a lot of ARPGs, and then my brothers have varying experience, and I feel each one of them has different insights on things that either I didn't think of, or things that I say that they didn't think of. So this is a great chance to kind of go back and reset kind of our expectations of an ARPG, and go over things that may be specific to this one, or maybe are just good practices in general in games like this, because it does stick to a lot of the tropes that you would expect from an ARPG, which I don't think is a bad thing. So let me know your thoughts on the game below if you've tried it. If you haven't tried it, let me know, like, do you intend to? Is there a reason you're not going to, or are you just waiting for something? It is kind of hard on hardware. It's absolutely visually stunning, but like, even my Shadow PC struggles if I'm also streaming. So just be really aware that this game is graphically nuts, and feel free to give it a shot if the bugs don't bother you. Just trying to make it real. It's your call. If I could talk to another me in the past, I would say this is a 100% worthwhile purchase. But knowing that everybody has different values, I just can't promise that to you. It's just not that perfect of a title yet. Maybe it'll get there. We can hope. My name's Chris with Work to Game. I hope you guys have a fantastic day. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.